Good afternoon and good morning to everyone joining us from the US. My name is Ramin Baghai. I'm a research member at the ECGI and a faculty member at the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. We would like to welcome all of our speakers, discussants, and attendees who are joining us for day 2 of the SHoF ECGI conference on sustainable finance and corporate governance. We have an exciting set of papers lined up today, but before we move to the program, I would like to sort of mention a brief reminder of the ground rules that will help us facilitate our conference. So these sessions will be recorded, are being recorded. Speakers will have 30 minutes for their presentation. Discussants will then have 10 minutes, and then the remaining 5 minutes will go to the speaker for responses. And if time permits, we can take a couple of questions from the audience. We will then have, hypothetically speaking, a break of 5 minutes between papers. And during the presentations, we ask audience members to please use the Q&A function in Zoom to add your questions for the speakers. And also please vote up questions you find particularly interesting. So thanks everyone, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations and discussions today. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to the first speaker, Anjan Thakor from the Olin School of Business, Washington University at St. Louis. He will present the paper entitled Higher Purpose, Incentives, and Economic Performance. I will briefly interrupt and announce when there are 5 minutes left in the presentation, so apologies for that already, to make sure that we are on track. Anjan, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Ramin. Let's see, here we go. So this paper is joint work with Bob Quinn, my former colleague from Michigan. Let me give you a little bit of background for how we came at this paper. So as you know, there's been a lot of interest in the past few years in organizational and personal higher purpose. And the question is, why now this surge of interest, both within academic research, but also in policy discussions. So before I answer the question, I just want to tell you a short story. So Bob is a professor of organization behavior. So, you know, the way these people interact is very different from the way that we're used to interacting in finance and economics, as you all know from your own experience in working with or interacting with OB faculty in your schools. So anyway, Bob had made a short video on the importance of personal higher purpose, and it's like a 5-minute video. And it was posted on something called Goalcast, and it was on the internet. So he sent me a link to the video, and he said, this was posted 3 days back. Can you guess how many downloads I got? Now you have to understand that my frame of reference for downloads is probably the same as yours, which is posting papers on SSRN. And then you get this email from SSRN saying, you know, your paper was in the top 10% of downloads or whatever. And then you get all excited, and then you scroll down, and then it says something like, your paper was downloaded 23 times. And, you know, that's sort of my frame of reference, right? You get 23 downloads, you're in the top 10% of downloads. So it only impresses people like us, but, you know, you tell anyone outside of academia, you know, 23 downloads, and they look at you like, so what? So with that frame of reference, I said, since he sent me the link, this must be a large number, right? So I wanted to guess something totally ridiculous. So I said 3,000. It'd only been on the internet for 3 days. So I thought that was quite a stretch. So he emails me back and he says, no, 300,000. And then within a month, he had 15 million downloads, and he was just inundated. His inbox was just flooded with emails from people all over the world, you know, talking about how this was really meaningful. And so I saw the video and I said, wow, you know, I didn't think, I mean, I thought it was a good video, but the impact and the way that people reacted to it was just, you know, beyond my imagination. So, you know, I emailed Bob back and I said, well, what does this mean? You know, that so many people were interested in this and they reacted like this. And he said, you know, there's a lot of hunger at the personal level for purpose out there. And then recently I did a survey with an OB colleague of mine here of 1,100 people in the US. So these were all households, all these people were employed. So that was one of the conditions for the survey. And it was really asking questions about personal and organizational higher purpose. It was very interesting because we did this, during the lockdown and so on. So we had questions like, do you have a written statement of higher purpose for your own life? Does your organization have a statement of higher purpose? How did you cope with the lockdown and the pandemic? And we learned a lot of interesting things. Now, these are all correlations. It's not causal; it's a survey. But one of the things that the survey revealed is that people who work in organizations that have a written statement of higher purpose also are more likely to have a personal statement of higher purpose. Now, whether that's a selection effect or an influence effect, we can't tell. But the other interesting thing that we learned is that when they believe in the purpose of the organization, these people also trust the leaders of the organization to make better business decisions. So there are some spillover effects from, as an employee, do I believe in the purpose of the organization, to how capable I think the leaders of the organization are in actually running the business, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. And by the way, so Bob and I, we began our journey about 2 years before we wrote this paper that was published in the Harvard Business Review. It was really based on interviews. So it's stuff that I haven't done before. But we interviewed CEOs and leaders of about 40 organizations, public, private, large, small, for some not for profit organizations as well. And then based on that, we wrote a paper on how successful leaders create what we call purpose-driven organizations, and what lessons do we learn from that. So that was published in 2018 in the HBR. I'd never published in the HBR before, so that was kind of an interesting experience. And they featured it on the cover, When Work Has Meaning, how to turn purpose into performance. So the way that I come at this is really from the standpoint of how organizational higher purpose, which is something distinct from CSR or charity or ESG or those sorts of things, how that impacts people's behavior in organizations, how it changes their incentives, and then what sort of economic outcomes that produces. So this paper is really sort of a first step in putting together a framework for understanding that in a language that makes sense to me, which is the standard language of contracting, incentives, economics. So keep that in mind as we go along. Okay. All right. So, what is higher purpose? What do we mean by it? So it turns out that there is no settled definition in the literature, and you really have to go to the literature and strategy and OB, and there's some in economics. The Henderson and Van den Steen paper was in the AER papers and proceedings. But here are 3 different definitions, and I'll sort of identify what we think of as higher purpose that I think cuts across the common elements of these definitions. So Bartlett and Ghoshal define it in their paper as the statement of a company's moral response to its broadly defined responsibilities, not an amoral plan for exploiting commercial opportunities. So the idea here is that it's something that transcends your business goals. Gartenberg, Pratt, and Serafeim in a recent paper in Organization Science define it as higher purpose need not be pro-social, but it is the company's reason for being, okay? And Henderson and Van den Steen define it as a concrete goal or objective for the firm that reaches beyond profit maximization. So there's a certain vagueness in these definitions, but there are also certain common elements. All right, so we define higher purpose as a pro-social contribution goal. So, higher purpose doesn't have to be pro-social, but really the higher purpose that we're focusing on in this paper is the pro-social subset of all ways in which you could define higher purpose. So it's a pro-social contribution goal that transcends your business goals while intersecting them. So we're not interested in charity. The Bill Gates Foundation may do great work, but its charitable work is not related to the main business of Microsoft. So we're really interested in sort of the intersection of business goals and higher purpose. How does it affect your day-to-day decisions and allocation of resources within the firm? Now, in the survey, the interview-based research that we did, what we found is that most organizational statements of higher purpose tend to fall in one of three categories. They're either customer-centric, employee-centric, or they're explicitly pro-social. Okay, and so you see all three. So there's a lot of variety. All right, so now, what did we learn from our interviews of the CEOs that we featured in the HBR articles? So these are, I'll call them stylized facts, for lack of a better term, but these were the key takeaways. So an organizational higher purpose is a pro-social contribution, that contribution goal. So it's always stated as a contribution goal, something that I'm going to do for some stakeholder group, right? That is customer-centric, employee-centric, or explicitly society-centric. When the organization embraces higher purpose, it tends to dissipate intra-firm agency frictions. And it motivates your employees to work harder for the same wages or provide the same effort for lower wages. But the other thing that we learned in this interview-based research is that to have this effect, the purpose must be authentic, and that the successful organizations expend a lot of resources in connecting employees to the purpose. Meaning, I may be a mid-level manager in a firm, and the firm can have this higher purpose that's sort of, at some level, almost generic sounding. But, what does it mean to me at my level in the organization? How does it change my decision making? And organizations, including one that Bob and I are working with in helping them, we spent some time with the top 15 in what we call discovering purpose and creating a statement. And now we're taking the top 200 people in the organization below the executive committee through a sequence of steps to connect what the individual employee does to the purpose of the organization. But this is something that the successful organizations do in a variety of ways. The higher the personal utility the leaders of the organization attach to the purpose, the stronger is the effect it has on employees. So it's kind of interesting that employees not only look at the authenticity of the purpose, meaning is this just posters on walls for external consumption? Every company has a statement of values and so on. Pretty meaningless because they don't affect decision making. Or is this real? And the more passionately the leaders of the organization commit to this, the stronger is the effect it has on employees. And then commitment to an authentic higher purpose often sacrifices profits in the short run. So in almost every case that we looked at, there was a direct organizational cost that was imposed. But despite that cost in the short run, the long run effects in the successful organizations were actually strikingly positive, right? So the question here is, how do we model this stuff? And so we're going to use optimal contracting, but then at some point, I'm going to step outside of the standard framework while still working broadly in this optimal contracting framework. Okay, so here's the model. Okay, so we have N, so N capital N agents in the firm. Okay, N is just exogenous. Everybody's risk neutral. The owner is going to divert a fraction of the firm's output. The output is Z, some fraction alpha is going to be diverted to this higher purpose in a visible way. And let's say for the time being that, unlike Friedman's concern, the diversion of output is just going to be for higher purpose. Later on, I'll talk about what if I can masquerade a higher purpose investment is just something I'm doing to derive personal benefits. But for now, this is observable. So alpha Z is directed to higher purpose. And then the owner, the principal, gets some utility beta times omega of alpha Z. And the employee gets some utility, which is V of alpha Z. And then later on, we have some modeling to provide a micro foundation for why the employee would prefer to have the firm make this investment in higher purpose rather than just give the money, this diversion, to the employees as additional compensation. Why the investment in higher purpose may actually be preferred by the employees. The employees provide effort. Each of them gets a wage contingent, an output contingent wage contract, and the owner provides capital I, and then that in combination produces an output, which is a function of the effort provision of the employees. So the employee's effort is E, that determines the success probability Q of E. And if you succeed, you get this positive output C. If you fail, you get 0. Okay. So that's a setup. Now, like I said, we have N agents or N employees, and the aggregate output is just the sum of the N employees. And for simplicity, we assume that the outputs of the N agents are conditionally perfectly correlated. So if they all take the same effort, then everybody has the same probability distribution of outputs, but they're perfectly correlated. So it's not IIDs. So everybody succeeds at the same time. All right. So just 2 points in time. The firm makes a take it or leave it wage offer to the employee, which is a wage, W as a function of that employee's output, ZI. Every employee's output is observable. And so you can write output contingent wage contracts. All consumption occurs at date 1. And you can't give the employee less than 0 wages, right? So there's a lower bound on wages. And then the owner makes a binding pre-commitment to divert a fraction alpha of the output to higher purpose. So the observed output is going to be 1 minus alpha of Zn, which is the aggregate output from the N agents. And then the owner gets some concave utility from that. And we're going to allow this beta, which is the value attached to this utility from higher purpose, which is omega. This beta, which is the weighting factor, is going to vary in the cross section. So it can be either 0, so your owner only cares about profit, in which case any investment you make in purpose will be simply to motivate employees. Or beta L, which is you attach a low value but positive value to purpose, and then beta H, you attach a very high value to purpose. So we're going to allow the owner to not really care about purpose, but do it simply to motivate employees who are always going to care about purpose. Okay. Each owner is going to know her beta privately, right? And so there's a possibility of owners mimicking each other. And then given the observed alpha, the employees seek wage contracts. Like I said, you get take it or leave it offers, and employees are hired. They all choose E, and then at date 1, you realize the output. Now, I'm not going to say too much about this because of time constraints, but the employee enjoys a utility, and the employee can be of one of 2 types, a high type or a low type. And the high type gets a bigger utility from this purpose than the low type gets. And the idea, the micro foundation for this is that I enjoy social interactions with other purpose who share my sense, who share my affinity for that purpose. And when I interact with them outside of the firm, if my firm has a sense of higher purpose, some of that social benefit kind of rubs off on me because people I interact with know that I'm working for this firm with a higher purpose. The idea is if you're an employee of 4Ocean, you're going to likely to care more deeply about ocean pollution than others, and you enjoy interacting with other people who care about plastic pollution in the oceans. All right, the type L doesn't care about purpose. Again, each agent privately knows his type. And then this V hat of alpha Zn is simply to indicate that you can get a utility from interacting with others in a social setting who share that affinity for purpose, regardless of your effort in the firm. So that's the first term. Or some of that utility depends on how successful your firm is in implementing purpose. Okay. And this psi of beta is really a measure of the authenticity of the business's belief in its higher purpose. So if for normalization of this is 1, then there's no verification of authenticity of purpose by the employees. The employee doesn't really shape my identity and has no influence on my appreciation of the higher purpose. But if psi is bigger than 1, then working at that firm is making me appreciate that purpose more. All of this is simply to microfound why I care that my organization cares about purpose, as opposed to just being paid money. Okay. So in the base model, this is the maximization program, right? The owner is going to solve a problem where he's maximizing over the wage contract and the allocation of output to purpose. So alpha is the fraction of output that is being allocated to purpose. E is the effort, N is the number of employees. So my actual business output is N times 1 minus alpha times Z. Then the beta times omega is the owner's utility from the purpose. And minus NW, that's how much I'm paying in aggregate wages. And then we have the IR constraint for the employee, which is, what do I get from wages plus the utility I enjoy from working for the organization that has purpose. And E is the effort. So I only get that utility, of course, if E is also the success probability. So we assume Q of E is equal to E. So if I choose effort, if I choose a certain effort, then I get a higher probability of success. So, and then an effort is chosen in a continuum. So whatever effort I choose, that's my success probability. It's okay. And then this is, and then there's an effort disutility, which is quadratic. And then G of UH is the utility that I enjoy. That's my reservation utility, because that's what I can get even if I don't work for the firm through my interaction with other people if I'm type H. All right, so let me just go over the results quickly in the last 10 minutes or so that I have. So the first result is that the employee would prefer that the firm make this investment in purpose than the firm paying the employee more in wages in the successful state. So the whole idea is that if the firm invests in purpose, that actually enhances my utility more for my social interactions, because sort of the social reputation of the firm spills over into a greater value that I get from my social interactions with others. And that's actually more valuable to me in a utility sense than just getting the cash. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And then we look at 2 cases. One is where psi of beta is just 1. So the firm makes an investment in higher purpose, but there's no verification of authenticity. All firms are exactly the same. So the owner's commitment to purpose, which is beta, doesn't really make any difference to me as an employee. That's the way to think about it. I only care about the allocation, alpha to purpose. And then we solve for the optimal contracts. But the main takeaway is this picture in Proposition 1, which shows that if in fact the employee's commitment to purpose doesn't matter. So I don't care if the owner's commitment doesn't matter. So I don't care if the owner genuinely believes in purpose, which means beta is bigger than 0, or the owner personally doesn't care about the purpose of beta is 0. So it doesn't matter to me as an employee what value the owner attaches to purpose. That's irrelevant. All that I care about is that the firm allocates some portion of its output to this purpose, right? It's this pro-social contribution goal. So I'm only concerned about alpha, right? I don't care about the owner's beta, okay? So if I don't care about the owner's commitment to purpose, meaning that doesn't influence the utility that I as an employee get from purpose, then what you get is this graph where net profit is actually, it peaks at beta equals 0. Okay, so even the owner who doesn't care about purpose is going to make some investment in higher purpose. The intuition is pretty simple. I want to make an investment in purpose, even though I don't care about it. Why? Because I know that it positively influences my employees and they're going to invest more in effort. And so I can get more effort for the same wages, right? Or I can get a higher effort for the same wages, or the same effort for a lower wage. But either way, making that investment is worthwhile purely from an incentive standpoint, okay? And so the maximum profit is achieved by the owner who has no personal value to purpose. Now, if I attach a personal value to purpose, then obviously I'm going to allocate more to purpose than somebody who just invests beta equals zero. But that allocation does nothing for profit, right? Because it doesn't produce higher effort by the employees. So profit then declines as beta increases, and the lowest net profit is actually achieved by the firm whose owner attaches the most value to purpose. Okay.
5 more minutes.
Okay. All right, and then, but if C is increasing in beta, okay, then your employees will not attach any value to purpose if you as the owner don't attach any value. So now there's like this perfect correlation between the value to purpose attached by the owner and the employee. In this case, the situation changes, and what you find is that now net profit is non-monotonic in beta when authenticity of purpose matters. So the owner's personal value of purpose matters to the employees. And in this case, what you get is that actually net profit is maximized at beta equals beta L, okay, not at beta equals zero, okay? And the beta equals zero owner will invest nothing in purpose. Okay, so then we model this extension with external financing where we allow the owners again to have 3 different possible values of beta, but now you have to raise external financing to invest in the project. And the owner also has to introduce an agency problem. We assume that the owner has some private benefit project that he can invest in, she can invest in unobservably, right? So now what happens is you get this Friedman effect, which is that external financiers don't know if the money that's being raised will actually be invested in an authentic purpose that will motivate employees, or whether it's going to be diverted for a personal benefit project. So now what happens is that there's like an upper bound on how much you can divert to either purpose or this personal benefit project, because financiers and employees can't tell the difference between whether the money was spent on something just for private benefits of the owner or for authentic higher purpose. So you can solve for like an upper bound alpha bar beyond which the firm cannot invest. And here the main result is that sort of the main takeaway is that this agency problem or this friction where I can actually just waste money and claim that I invested in a higher purpose project has the effect of squeezing out investments in purpose. Okay, so the lower line in this, the lower curve in this picture is kind of the net profit when the owners can divert for personal consumption, and the blue curve above that is the net profit when personal benefit diversion is impossible. So all investments in purpose decline, and net profit peaks at a lower diversion of resources to higher purpose. So basically, agency problems tend to squeeze out these investments in purpose. So this kind of joins together Friedman's insight that all this purpose stuff is just nonsense, that firms should just focus on profit maximization, with this notion that pro-social contribution goals and purpose actually can make a positive contribution to profits. And the answer is sort of yes to both. They can make a positive contribution, but these agency problems and frictions also tend to squeeze out and reduce higher purpose investments. All right, so in the 1 or 2 minutes that I have, let me conclude and say that the paper has provided a framework to analyze the economic implications of organizational higher purpose. And what we show is that the adoption of purpose in some cases leads to a lower wage bill and higher profit, even though you're explicitly sacrificing output to invest in higher purpose. And so we identify conditions under which this happens. It doesn't always happen, but there are some conditions under which you can get this. In this model, this higher purpose is integrated into the operations of the firm. So it's not charity or CSR or any of those things. With external financing and the possibility that private benefit related consumption may be masquerading as higher purpose, investments in purpose decline. Okay. And if customers and or financiers value purpose, which I didn't have time to go into that, but the results there are pretty obvious. That if your customers value purpose, if your financiers, external financiers value purpose, then investments in higher purpose will increase. In the model that I just showed you, the financiers attach no value to purpose. So everything is being priced so that they break even. So they don't really care what impact purpose has. They simply price these securities so that they get their expected return, commensurate with the perceived risk and the output. Now, one of the things that I didn't do because time is short, is I didn't talk about the emerging literature on this, on purpose and investments, which includes a very nice paper by my discussant. So I didn't put all that, but I didn't have a chance to go through kind of a lit review. So this is not meant to indicate that, this is the only purpose paper that is looking at purpose. There's actually quite an emerging literature on this. It's still small, but I think a lot of people are interested in looking at issues of not only purpose, but also related issues like CSR and economic implications. So the paper has a more extensive discussion of the related literature, but in the interest of time, I didn't go into that. So, and I'm sure Martin covered that.
Thank you so much for the interesting paper. And the discussant is Martin Oehmke from the London School of Economics. Martin, you have 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. I think Anjan, okay, you've stopped sharing. Let me bring up my slides.
Oh,
there we go. All right. Thanks very much. I'm struggling a bit with my voice today. Sorry, but should be okay. I really enjoyed reading this paper. In a way, fitting. There are all these articles that I saw popping up, in recent weeks about the 50th anniversary of, the Friedman Doctrine. Friedman's famous or infamous New York Times article that came out 50 years ago, where he declared that the sole purpose and the only one or the sole social responsibility of a business is to pursue maximum profits. And so we can think of this paper and this conference as asking, or saying either happy birthday, happy 50th Friedman Doctrine, or, perhaps is this doctrine in some sort of a midlife crisis? And, to give some context, I think Anjan really brought that out very nicely in his presentation. But, this, midlife crisis, we can think of as, when you look around and you at least look at what companies say, then usually they don't say our purpose or our mission is to maximize profits. I'm going to pick one example of a company that you may or may not know. It's a company called BioLite. I know this company because my wife, when we were in New York, used to work at a design consultancy, and one of her colleagues there then started founding this company. This company makes small stoves, camping stoves in a way that, you put wood chips in, they burn very cleanly. You can also charge your phone on them. But the whole idea was to do that, but at the same time, whenever you sell one of these stoves, to donate a stove somewhere in a developing country. And now they've branched out to other, light and other energies, so they see themselves as a micro energy company, right? But I remember back then thinking about, well, this, type of activity that they're doing, are they doing this to maximize profits? Are they, do-gooders, and they just, feel great about also bringing energy and clean fuel to developing countries? And, as economists, how should we think about this? Well, if you look on their website, then it seems like maybe they're not maximizing profits. I just mentioned this, that, whenever you buy something from their shop, then they call it here that they reinvest into bringing safe cooking and lighting and charging into sub-Saharan Africa. But, if you actually talk to them, then this is not something that they make money on. In fact, these stoves are not that cheap, so they actually lose money if you look in isolation at this activity. Right, but that of course doesn't mean in aggregate they're not maximizing profits. Maybe they're making this back somewhere else. So I think from that perspective, Anjan's paper raises a really interesting question. What is this this mission or purpose actually doing, and how does it relate to profit maximization or not? Who could drive this type of motivation beyond profit? And Anjan had this nice illustration, which is very similar to what I'm going to put on right now. But I'm also, Anjan, going to help you out, because on this slide I'm going to say something at least about a part of this literature that's emerging here, right? So we could think of as owners as caring about higher purpose. We could think of employees. We could think of the firm's customers. In the previous example, maybe the people who are buying a camping stove who also value that another stove will go to a family in sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe investors in a company. And for most of the paper, Anjan's paper looks at, I would say the main focus is on employees, but there's this twist that, owners may or may not care themselves, which I'll come back to, which I think is one of the interesting parts of the paper. And then we could fill in, and this is also from my perspective going to be somewhat incomplete, but we could, fill in these other, other papers that are out there. If I think of employees, what comes to my mind is literature on motivated agents, papers like Besley Gattag, Benabout-Giraud. Customers, there are probably many more, but Rui Albuquerque and co-authors have one in management science where social responsibility brings about customer loyalty. And then the next paper you'll see today by Augustin, or the paper that Marcus Opp and I have written, look very much from the investor perspective, right? And so we can see, like Anjan said, there's a lot of interest, I think, at the different angles from which objectives beyond profit can play a role. Let me give you the key way in which this particular paper works. And, there is some stuff that I'm not going to talk about. The paper really has, a number of interesting extensions that I won't have time for, but I want to give you kind of the main gist of what I found interesting in this paper. And the key channel through which a lot of the results in the paper work is employees. And the way I thought about it reading the paper is something like a dinner party conversation. A friend hosts the dinner party, you show up, you talk to people, people say, well, what do you do? And then, either you can say, I work for, I don't know, say Goldman Sachs, and people think, okay, you're a profit maximizer. Or maybe you say, I work for BioLite, and actually in doing so, I also bring energy and clean stoves and so on to sub-Saharan Africa. And maybe immediately people will find you interesting, and you derive utility from these dinner party conversations. And if this is the case, then that can be an efficient way, Anjan brought it out nicely, for a company to pay, right? Because pay in quotation marks, because there are now scale economies. You do this good activity as a company, but every single of your employees who goes to a dinner party derives a benefit from that. So you do the action once, but everybody at their respective dinner parties, when they happen again after COVID, can talk about these interesting things. And so it makes sense from a company's perspective to use this type of compensation rather than, say, giving every employee some cash that they can donate, for example. What this does, and this is similar or at least related to some of the motivated agent papers, it's going to relax your agency problem, right? Because now you have this additional way through which to motivate or compensate the agent. And so, in fact, you may now do this even if you don't care as a principle about this higher purpose. A key thing, and this is one of the things I found most interesting that this paper shows, is that you want to think hard about commitment here, or what Anjan calls authenticity. The principal must care, or at least the results depend on whether the principal herself cares about this higher purpose or not. In the model, this is essentially because of a timing assumption. You promise higher purpose, but you can only invest in higher purpose once the agents have produced. And so there is a possibility that you turn around and say, okay, I know I promised you this, but actually I'm not going to give any stoves to people in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to pay out dividends. Now, let's look again at how this commitment matters. And here this slide, I try to come up with a nice tongue twister for all of you. Because when we think about this question, we can come back to what I raised earlier, which is, do companies, by having a higher purpose, maximizing profit or not? Or to put it in my tongue twister way, is not maximizing profit potentially profit maximizing? And the answer to this depends on commitment. Let me show you the two main cases that Anjan also showed. Let's first think of an owner who one way or another can commit to higher purpose. So when the owner says at date 0, look, I'm going to give some stoves to sub-Saharan Africa, that can actually be, made a credible commitment. Then even an owner who cares only about profit is going to invest in higher purpose. And the reason is this relaxation of the agency problem. Owners who care about higher purpose also invest in higher purpose. In fact, they're going to invest more, but they're going to sacrifice profits now in order to invest in higher purpose, whereas the owner who only cares about profits, does higher purpose activities only for a profit purpose. On the other hand, if the owner cannot commit to higher purpose, then the profit maximizing owner becomes inauthentic, incredible. People realize that he's going to say, I'm going to give these stoves to sub-Saharan Africa, but ex post, it's not going to happen. And so now what we see is that owners who don't care are not going to invest anything in higher purpose. The owners who do care will still do it, but this time around, and this is, is not maximizing profit maximizing, these guys are actually going to end up with higher profits, even though their own maximum or objective function is not a profit maximizing one. And so this, under the commitment issue of potentially being inauthentic, the authentic owners actually generate higher profits, which I thought was a very interesting result. Let me conclude my discussion by talking a little bit more about this commitment. And this is something where the authors perhaps can, maybe in another paper, dig a little bit deeper. In a one-shot model, commitment is essentially this timing assumption that I mentioned earlier. So HP investment can only take place after production, but you're promising it before production, and then we have this typical time inconsistency or potential time inconsistency issue. What this made me wonder is what happens in a more repeated setting, right? So higher purpose investments occur over time. Employees stay with the firm for a while, and they choose effort, every day or every week or every quarter or whatever it is. And so then, of course, you can wonder whether maybe, an inauthentic owner in some repeated setting can potentially, through the repeated game, commit to pursuing in some credible fashion some higher purpose, or whether the previous result still holds. The other interesting thing about the repeated setting, in my view, is that if you talk to people in industry, Patagonia is a good example. One of the things that they highlight, in addition to the compensation channel that is highlighted in this paper, is retention of employees. Patagonia say that because we are such do-gooders and we provide this kind of value-driven or mission-driven, higher purpose-driven environment, we don't have to recruit or replace employees very often, and that's something that saves us a lot of money in the long run. And so by going to this more dynamic setting, maybe Anjan and Quinn could also say something about that. I would find that interesting. Summary, I think I'm out of time. Very thought-provoking paper. Higher purpose relaxes agency frictions with this twist of authenticity, which I hadn't seen before in other papers on this topic. Higher purpose can indeed be profit maximizing, but it doesn't have to be, and the authenticity plays a role here. And as I said, some opportunity to potentially further explore the commitment, dynamic aspects, and so on. Thank you very much for the invitation to discuss.
All right, thank you so much, Martin. Anjan, we have a couple of minutes if you would like to respond.
Yes, Martin, thank you very much for that excellent discussion. If you would send me the slides, it'd be great. I'd appreciate it. So no, this was an excellent discussion. I think the way Martin explained it is absolutely right. The difference is whether or not you can commit to higher purpose or not, and that makes a big difference. I think the last comment that you made about looking at this in a dynamic setting is very much in line with what we've observed when we've interacted with companies and also in the interviews that we did. And what happens is that the way it actually plays out in practice, and it's not in the model, so I'm stepping a little bit outside the model, is that if you think about this in a dynamic setting, is that oftentimes the diversion of resources to purpose is not like a one-shot thing that the firm does at the outset, right? It's kind of an ongoing thing. But there is an embedded promise in that statement of higher purpose that really doesn't get tested until the firm faces a crisis. And there's one firm that we talked to, and they said during the Part of their purpose was, treating employees as a family. And what happened is that they got to the 07-09 crisis and they had to cut their costs by at least 20% just to survive. And they said 50% of our cost is labor. So the easiest thing to do would have been to just simply lay off people. But they said that would have been inconsistent with the purpose. And that was like the first real test of the authenticity of the purpose and how much are you willing to sacrifice. And they made a decision to not do that. And they just basically told their employees, hey, we need to reduce our costs by 20%. But we're not going to lay anybody off. Could you all please give us your ideas on how we can do that without laying anybody off? So I think the dynamic setting raises a lot of interesting issues, not only about the allocations of resources that you make to purpose on an ongoing basis, but sort of what happens when the organization is really tested. And that's where the authenticity of purpose gets tested. So thank you. That was a very useful point.
All right. Thank you so much.